Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. I hope you guys are ready to do some spiritual exercise. That's what we're going to do this afternoon as we open the Word together and we look at a passage from Hebrews chapter 12. Now, in the passage that we're going to look at today, we're going to see the author of Hebrews explaining the Christian life in the context or with the metaphor of running a marathon. This is a common metaphor that runs throughout the New Testament in describing the Christian life. Several of the New Testament writers describe the Christian life as that of running a marathon, something that takes preparation and conditioning. It takes stamina. It takes all kinds of things in order to be able to complete this race that we call the Christian life. And in Hebrews chapter 12, the author deals with that concept specifically, and he offers to us some encouragement and some keys to running this race that we call the Christian life. Now, most of you in here probably either know someone who has run a marathon or perhaps you've run one yourself. But there are some common misconceptions about marathon runners. The first one of those is that not all marathon runners are trying to win first place. Believe it or not, all of those people who are struggling and preparing and conditioning their bodies to run that 26.2 mile marathon are not actually trying to come in first place. More often than not, what they are trying to do is to prove something to themselves. They are trying to demonstrate that they have had the discipline to prepare their bodies and the discipline to run that race, and not necessarily to win it, but to complete it. So they're not always trying to win first place. Their challenge is more in trying to challenge themselves and to prove to themselves that they have the discipline to carry out the race or to complete the race. Most people who run a marathon would tell you that the most difficult thing about running a marathon is the preparation for it. It is the discipline that it takes in order to be able to run a marathon. You don't just wake up one week and then decide you're going to run a marathon the next week. It takes months and months of preparation and discipline and body conditioning in order to be able to run a marathon race. The Christian life is really no different. The Christian life is something that you don't just wake up one day and set about to do and accomplish in a day. The Christian life will take the rest of your lifetime to complete. It is a marathon that will last until your natural death or until Christ returns, whichever comes first. So we need to understand that this marathon we call the Christian life is not a sprint. It's not a 100-yard dash. It is a lifelong marathon that we are engaged in. It will take the rest of our lives to complete. And it takes an immense amount of conditioning, preparation, and stamina. And most importantly, it has to have a goal that we focus on in order to complete that race. All of the runners run and they look toward the finish line of crossing that finish line. That is their goal. And that is the goal for the Christian life. It's not to necessarily come in first place or to beat everyone else on the track or to win the gold medal, but it is to complete the race. That is what the race is designed to do, and that is why the runners run. Now, the author of the Hebrews gives us 5 keys in these 2 short verses today, telling us or equipping us to run this race that we've been called to. He gives us 5 keys that we can utilize in our own lives in order to complete the race that has been set before us. We first of all have the encouragement of those who've run the race before. There are many millions of people who have walked in our shoes, who have lived out our life of faith in following Christ Jesus. There are millions who have gone before us, and the way they lived their lives, the way they endured their struggles and trials and temptations should be an example and an encouragement to those of us who are living that out today. We should look to those who have gone on before as encouragement. But secondly, we need to free ourselves from the entanglements of life that seem to slow us down. So we have the encouragement of those who've gone before, but life itself offers us entanglements which hold us back. They slow us down from living out the Christian life. They slow us down because they distract us from the course that Jesus Christ has set before us. Our job is to break free from those entanglements, to not be held back or slowed down or distracted from the course that Christ has set us on by these entanglements of life. And they come in a number of different forms that we'll talk about here this afternoon. Thirdly, we need to train ourselves for endurance in order to complete the race. Any marathon runner would tell you that conditioning is an absolute necessity in preparing for a marathon. It takes discipline to run that race, and that discipline is only gained through training and through trials and through struggles in order to gain the discipline needed to complete the race. And then also, most importantly, what we need to realize from this passage this morning is that we have the example of Jesus to look to and to imitate. He ran the race before any of us. He ran it first. He blazed the trail that we call the Christian life. And we as his followers should look to his example and imitate what he has done and follow in his footsteps. And then finally, we must recognize that God has not left us alone in this world to complete the race on our own. He never called us to run this race alone or in our own power. But instead, it is the enabling grace of Jesus Christ that allows us to run this race at all. And furthermore, to complete that race. Because left to our own devices, nearly every one of us would fail in the race of the Christian life. But Christ has won for us. He has earned for us through his sacrifice the grace necessary in order to be able to live out the Christian life. So those are the 5 keys from the passage of Hebrews this morning that we're going to examine today. But first, let's turn to the passage itself, and let's look at the goal of the Christian life. It is not to win the race, but it is to run in faith and to complete that course. If you would stand with me this afternoon as we read the passage from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Thank you. Please be seated. So the 5 keys to completing the race of the Christian life. Let's look at these together this morning. The first key is that we run in faith by being encouraged with the witness of those who've gone before us. We run in faith by being encouraged with the witness of those who've gone on before us. So who are these that have gone on before us? Who are these witnesses? Well, the author to the Hebrews writes in verse 1, Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. So who is this group of witnesses? Who are these people? Well, in the context of Hebrews, we understand that to be the people that the author has just finished speaking about in chapter 11. The so-called great hall of faith of Hebrews that enumerates people who have lived the Christian life all the way back to the earliest beginnings of creation. Those stories of Abel and Abraham and Moses and Samson and the prophets who believed and who trusted in God, those who had gone before us, looking forward to the promise that God would deliver to his people. This is the cloud of witnesses who surround us. And for the Hebrews who read this book originally, this would have been the group to whom the author was referring. But even for those of us today, we understand the identity of these witnesses with which we're surrounded by are all of those people who have gone on before us. Those who have lived the Christian life, they have run in faith this marathon that we call the Christian life. All of those who have run and who have had faith and who have trusted and who have endured struggles and trials and temptations, these are the ones who have gone on before, and they've gone on to be with the Lord. We recognize they are gone, but they are not forgotten. Their identity is not so much what is important to us as it is their testimony. We look to their lives as an example for our own. We see that how they have marched out in faith and they have lived out the Christian life despite all of the struggles that life has thrown at them. They have sought to accomplish and to complete the course that Christ has laid out before them, and they have finished their race. They serve as an encouragement to us because we can look to their example of how they live their lives and apply those practices in our own lives. Now, the author is specifically referring to those in Hebrews 11, but it can be any of those who have gone on before us, any who have completed their race of the Christian life. We look to those who have run before us because they are an example to us and how we should live out our lives. Hebrews 11:39 tells us that even they had it tougher than we did because their course was tougher than ours because they hadn't yet realized the promise that God had granted. They, in Hebrews 11, were still looking forward to the promise of Christ coming and the salvation that He had won for us at the cross. They couldn't see it. They didn't realize the promises, yet they trusted God. They believed in God and they trusted Him and they followed Him in faith. And for that, they are enumerated here in Hebrews chapter 11. We living today have examples to follow as well. Those who are now looking back on the promises of God, but yet nonetheless are still following in the footsteps of Jesus. We look to their example in order to be encouraged as we live out and we run our own race, knowing that they stand before us as people to whom we can look and be encouraged by their story. And that's why we say it's not so much important about the identity of the witnesses as much as it is their testimony of who they are, of what they have done. It is not them that are the encouragement, but rather it is their testimony that is the encouragement to us. How they lived their lives, how they ran the race in faith, how they endured and they overcame the difficulties and the trials and the struggles that were laid in front of them on their course. Like hurdles in the middle of a 100-yard dash, they dodged the hurdles, they jumped the hurdles, and they persevered. And they carried on toward the finish line to the end of the race. It is their testimony that is an encouragement to us. To see that others have gone before and they have finished. They have completed their course and that we can too. Now, most often I think in this passage that we're looking at today, there's always this big vision of a giant stadium that is filled with those of us who are Christians lined up on a track, and that the stands are surrounded by thousands upon thousands of witnesses or spectators who are cheering us on. Run, go, run, keep it up, don't give up, don't quit. The problem is that's not exactly what's being communicated by the text. It's not that these people who have gone before us are now looking back on us and encouraging us. They're with the Lord. They're not distracted by what goes on here in this world. They're not even aware of what goes on here in this world. A great gulf has been fixed between those who know Christ and are in eternity with Him and those who are not. They're not concerned with the pains and the struggles that we are dealing with down here. The view that we should have of this passage is of a bunch of runners standing in a great hall of fame. You ever been to a hall of fame? There are a number of them across this country. There's the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame. There's the National Football League Hall of Fame. There's the Country Music Hall of Fame. And in every one of those, you're going to find the pioneers, the trailblazers of those relevant halls of fame. And they're going to be the people who have come first, who have gone ahead, and who have blazed the trail. And many who go into these halls of fame look to these people as an example, as someone to emulate, or their method or their practice they try and imitate or copy and apply in their own lives because they see that that is where success lies. That's what's in view in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. It is not a group of spectators cheering us on, but it is the history and the testimony of those who have gone before that we look to. And we try and imitate and we try and follow in what they have done. Their testimony encourages us by saying, you can too. You can accomplish this. You can complete this race. The example is that we are to look to those who have gone on before. So the second key then becomes this. We run in faith by shedding the entanglements of life that hold us back. We run in faith by shedding the entanglements of life that hold us back. What are these entanglements? Well, let's look at it. There's two groups here enumerated in the passage. The first group is simply the delights of life. The preacher here says to lay aside every weight. Every weight. What's in view here is that of a runner. Someone who is stripping down, who is removing every ounce of extra weight that would impede their progress, that would hold them back from running the race faithfully and completing that race. They want to abandon everything that would hold them back or slow them down from running in the course of life. Now we understand here there's two groups of things that can do that. The first is the delights of life, or the pursuit of pleasure. We lay aside every weight. How do pleasures distract us in our life? But we understand that this includes the pleasures and pursuit of life which distract us from running in faith, even when those things in and of themselves are not sinful. God has given us many great things, many wonderful things in this life that we enjoy. Many wonderful things that distract us, unfortunately, from following in faith and from completing our course. Anything, even if it's not a sinful thing, can be something that eventually distracts us from running the race. They're a weight because they slow us down by becoming a distraction. There could be any number of those things. The pleasures of life can be almost as distracting to us as sin. Think about what those things can be. Maybe it's a family relationship. Maybe it's a job or a hobby or a habit. There are many good things that we have in our lives that can become such a distraction to us that we fail to advance on the track of life. We fail to move forward in faith and inch closer to that completion, to that finish line, because we are distracted by the good things in our lives. Think of the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19. This young man appears to Jesus and he says, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says to keep the commandments. And the young man says, "Well, I've done all of those." And Jesus then says, "Well, sell all you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me." But the text immediately then tells us that the young man has gone away sad. Why? Because he had great possessions. He couldn't follow Jesus because of the distractions in his life, because of the delights of his life. His possessions, even though the possessions were probably not sinful in and of themselves, had become such a distraction to him that he was no longer able to follow Jesus. The Bible says that we are to cast aside or to put off or to lay aside all of those things that slow us down, that distract us, and that keep us from following on the path that Christ has laid out before us. So the delights of life entangle us, but also the distractions of sin. Sin is the most common thing that handicaps our progress in the race of life, in the Christian life. We are held back by the distractions of sin. Look at verse 1. "Let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely." Sin, it clings so closely. You almost get the idea that it's something that envelops us, that wraps us up and digs its claws into us, and it holds on to us, acting like a weight, slowing us down and holding us back from what we are supposed to do. Alongside the delights of life, we find these distractions of sin in every area of life that become a distraction because of the time, the effort, the struggle, the guilt that goes along with besetting sin in our lives. It takes time to engage in sin. It takes effort in dealing with sin. There is a struggle to break free from sin. And more than anything else, I'm convinced that unconfessed sin, the guilt of that sin, hinders our progress in the Christian life. It holds us back. It slows us down. It doesn't permit us to advance. It's like a great weight being tied upon us that we can't break free from. Now notice here in the passage that the author doesn't reference a specific sin. It's not anything specific here. He doesn't itemize a sin. He just speaks of it in general. Sin in general will slow you down and hold you back from progressing in the race of life. He says, whatever it is, whatever your sin, get rid of it. Deal with it. Confess it. Get it out in the open. But whatever you do, you've got to get rid of it because it is slowing you down. It is holding you back. Now, I can remember running track in high school. And I remember at one of these particular meets that we went to, and you can understand, I was in high school a long time ago. So we didn't have these state-of-the-art track facilities that we see today. Oftentimes, some of the tracks that we went to were nothing more than a dirt field. They were just a dirt field that someone had taken some chalk and chalked out lines on the dirt. So you never knew what kind of track you were going to encounter when you went to a meet. And I remember coming to a track one time, and I was getting ready for my race, and I had only brought the long spikes that went into my shoes to run that day. Now, long spikes are designed for soft or loose surfaces so that they dig in so that the runner doesn't slip. The problem is the track that we came upon that day was a soft asphalt track. And in an asphalt track, a long spike digs right into it, where it makes your feet almost stick into the asphalt. But that was all I had. I had forgotten the short spikes that would have helped me in the race. So I ran with these long spikes, and each step being a burden, being a difficult effort just to break my foot free from the sticking of the spikes in each step. And as you can imagine, I placed very poorly in the race that day. And I can remember having to explain to my coach why I had placed so poorly that day. I told him the story about the spikes and what had happened, and he looked at me and he said, "Why didn't you just get rid of them?" See, I didn't have to run the race with those long spikes. I could have just taken them out and cast them aside and run freely with a plain pair of shoes. But I made a categorical error. I made a calculated flaw in my planning. I chose to let those spikes hold me back from advancing on the course. We must be proactive in laying aside anything and everything that entangles us and that holds us back from running the Christian life. That includes any pursuit in life, whatever it may be, that distracts me from following Jesus. Whether that is a pleasure of life or some blessing that God has given to me, if it is holding me back from following Jesus, I need to get rid of it. It doesn't matter what it is, even if it is not sinful. So what is holding you back today? Is it your job? Is the pursuit of wealth in your job or influence or power, is that holding you back from following Jesus today? Or you spend too much time and too much energy in servicing the job that you may or may not need anyway? Get another job. Maybe it's a personal relationship, someone that you just can't separate from in your life who is a bad influence upon your life. Somebody who is holding you back from advancing in the race of life. You need to end that relationship. You need to break free from that person who is holding you back. Maybe it's a hobby. Maybe a hobby is holding you back. I knew a guy several years ago that I worked with, loved to play golf. He played golf as many times a week as he could possibly play. He played golf so much that it was holding him back in his job. He was coming in late. He was leaving early. He was tired. He had injuries. Everything he ever talked about, he ate, slept, and breathed golf. And it held him back from advancing in his career, and he eventually lost his job because of it. Hobbies that take over our lives and distract us from following Christ are just as dangerous. So hobbies in and of themselves aren't bad. Nothing wrong with playing golf, right? But if that hobby comes to consume your life, and it comes to distract you from following Jesus in the race of life, then that is something that needs to be dealt with, whatever it may be. And then the third key, we run in faith by exercising endurance all the way to the finish line. We run in faith by exercising endurance all the way to the finish line. Now, endurance speaks of perseverance. It is this willingness, this utter willingness to not give up, to finish, to complete, to overcome. Perseverance often speaks of effort. It speaks of gutting it out to complete whatever it is that you set yourself up against. So having put off all the weights and the sin and everything that holds us back, we now need to focus on our endurance, on preparing ourselves and conditioning our lives to complete the race. To not be distracted by these things anymore, but to discipline ourselves, to be prepared and ready to run that race, focused on the finish line and moving forward, never giving up. Because the race is going to get tough. If you ask anybody who's ever run a marathon, I don't care how well prepared you are, how well conditioned you are, at some point your body is going to say, I quit. It is going to give up on you. It is only your inner spiritual perseverance that will keep you moving. It is only on pure gut that you are able to finish that race. Your body has long since gave up. That's a lot like how the Christian life is. Many of us reach a point in our life, in our walk with Jesus, where we're just ready to quit. We are ready to give up. We can't deal with the struggle anymore, the trials anymore, the pains anymore. We are done. But it is our inner strength, our spiritual strength, our dependence on Christ that keeps us moving forward, that keeps us advancing in the race. And that's what we have to be focused on. Verse 1, it says, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. The race has been set before us by Jesus. He has placed it before us, and He knows that it's going to take us a lifetime to complete it. That's why we need endurance. If you've ever run a marathon, you know that you don't take off out of the gate at a full sprint. you'll never make it. You pace yourselves for a long and difficult and